I'm going to make what I think is a fair presentation of the anti-gun, or maybe we'll just say pro-gun control argument. Okay, and then anybody here that's in the opposition, maybe, you can tell me whether or not you think I've at least done a semi-decent job of doing so. Okay, so here it goes. The issue is not that complicated. When we look at the amount of gun violence in the United States and we compare it with other countries around the world, what we see is that it's exponentially higher of countries which would be comparable. And by comparable, we talk about similar levels of development, education, maybe common cultural standards and things of that nature. It's much higher in the United States, significantly higher, almost up to 50,000 gun deaths a year. And it seems to be primarily in the United States. Not to mention the fact that latest statistics coming out of the CDC have illustrated that gun deaths have now become the leading cause of child deaths in the United States of America. That's horrendous. Any gun death is bad, but a gun death perpetrated against a child must be uniquely abhorred by any sort of civilized society. And so while there may be some consideration with respect to certain firearms that may be necessary for hunting, or may be appropriate for collecting, or maybe even appropriate for home defense on some levels, the idea that we have to pass greater restrictions on things like high-capacity magazines, assault weapons, maybe semi-automatic rifles or semi-automatic pistols, this is just a common sense thing that we have to do in order to care for the people that are clearly suffering as a result of this. And again, we have to recognize that what differentiates the United States from other countries in the world is that other countries in the world, which have people and have guns and have other similar circumstances that we're dealing with, violent video games or TV or whatever else we might consider, still don't have the same amount of gun violence. Why? Because guns are incredibly easy to get in the United States and they're far more difficult to get in other countries. So therefore, we need to have comprehensive, not only gun control, but we need to have things like buyback programs. We need to have restrictions on certain types of firearms. And yes, we may have certain categories where we actually need to engage in forms of confiscation, hopefully voluntary. But if people persist in keeping a hold of weapon systems that they don't need for any practical purpose with respect to home defense, hunting, or collection, well then yes, at some point there may be penalties associated with them not being willing to hand that over. And we can talk about what the just compensation would be, just like if we were going to do a taking with respect to eminent domain. But in the end, this is about saving lives. And I think we need to be far more concerned about the number of young people that are dying on our streets than the potential of foreign invasion or a government imposing absolute tyranny on us. Now, would that be a fair representation of what people that are usually asking for more gun control or even gun confiscation, that'd be a fair representation of some of the common arguments that you hear? Okay, so I'm not ignorant of the arguments. So why do I oppose them? Well, the first thing I want to do is I want to try to establish that I'm not literally Hitler, okay, and I'm not evil. It's not that I'm sitting here as a father of 3 children. It's not that I'm sitting here and I'm just obtuse, that I'm so obsessed with my gun fetish that I don't care about what's going on our streets or going on with respect to mass shootings, especially students being targeted. But I do have a different experience. Now, the first experience that I want to point out here is that I am old enough to remember when people would actually have guns in their cars during hunting season when they went to school. For pretty much as long as I can remember, and as long as we can look back in American history, guns have been fairly prolific. You know what hasn't been? School shootings. That's not fairly prolific in American history. And so I'm looking at this from the standpoint of a causation correlation issue. Something has happened that we definitely need to get to the bottom of as a society. And I'm not willing to accept that, well, if we just get rid of the guns, that takes care of it. That takes care of the violence. No, something is driving, especially younger and younger people, to commit acts of violent crime, whether it be things like gang violence, whether it be things like mass shootings, at increasing levels, which has to be addressed beyond simply pointing to the instrument that is being used and saying, well, just take that. The other thing I will say is I have a very unique experience also having served in Iraq. I have seen what happens to a population when they are summarily disarmed and left at the mercy of both criminal and terrorist elements. The other thing that I would point out is we should absolutely talk about the roughly 48,000 gun-related deaths that we will see in the United States. We should also be willing to point out that about 58% of them will be suicides. If you remove one implement, I'm willing to bet in many cases people find a new implement. And so I absolutely want to get to the bottom of how do we effectively address suicide. When it comes to a lot of the homicides that we're seeing, I absolutely want to address that too. I'm a little bit confused why so many of the people, and nobody gets to tell me this isn't true because I've seen it firsthand in the General Assembly in Virginia, why so many of the people that want to summarily disarm me also commonly advocate for the early release of violent felons. I don't understand that. That doesn't seem to make sense to me. I will also point out that one of the biggest problems that we have right now with respect to debate across a wide array of categories in this country is the deliberate manipulation of data for political ends. When the CDC comes out and says that firearms are the #1 killer of children, they are lying. They are lying in their own data. How do I know? Well, I look at the data, and how do they track it? Ages 1 to 19. Now, is it still horrific when an 18-year-old or a 19-year-old dies as a result of a firearm? Yes. But why are you including them in statistics with children when you don't include them in other statistics with children? Oh, it's because you want to try to make a stronger case. Oh, by the way, when we generally talk about children in these statistics, we don't include 18 and 19. We also don't typically include 15, 16, or 17. Why are they doing it for this status? In order to bump the numbers. What happens to firearms as the cause of death for children once you remove those? Oh, it goes from #1 to 19. I guess that doesn't sound as well on your flyer. Why do you start at 1 instead of when they're born? Because once again, it messes with your stats and your data. Now, anybody that does a cursory search of this can see that the CDC cooked the books to get a number. Here's what I don't like. When I point this out, what I will hear is, well, regardless of what that is, does it make it any less horrific? I'm like, no, stop. One of the reasons why we can't have civil debate as much in this country anymore is because we have decided that we're just going to manipulate data however we want. And then when you get caught manipulating it, your response is not to say, okay, that was inappropriate, they shouldn't have done it that way. Your response is to say, but who cares? Moving on. If you want us to be able to look at common data and common stats so we can come to conclusions and use reason and logic and the scientific method in order to properly diagnose problems so that we can hopefully come up with appropriate solutions, we have to be able to rely on the idea that the people gathering that data, analyzing that data, and putting stats out are doing so in good faith. Because when you take over an organization in order to manipulate it to get the results you want, what ends up happening is I don't just lose faith in that study, I lose faith in the organization conducting it. And more we find we have Americans getting in discussions with one another, arguing with one another, and they think, well, I've got the gold standard, I have this study. I don't even care what that study says anymore. I don't care what that organization says anymore. And the more of that we have, the less likely it is for us to be able to come to any sort of realistic compromise when it makes sense, or just correct conclusions in order to correct error in thinking. The other thing that I will point out with respect to firearms is the fact that the numbers range, but the broader estimates suggest anywhere from 2.5 to 3 million self-defense gun uses per year in America. The lower number is 500,000 per year, which means, we'll take the lower number, 500,000. So 500,000 times in America, somebody used a firearm in order to prevent themselves from becoming a victim. What happens when you take it away? Here's another problem that I have with gun violence statistics. Let's say you have the woman that has been a victim of domestic abuse. And she's done, she's tired of it. She's tired of getting hit. She's worried the next time she might die. So she gets a firearm. He comes over, He threatens her. She has to defend herself. She shoots him. Well, in the gun violence statistics, that is a worse scenario than if he beat her to death. You understand how that's tracked? She shoots the guy beating her. Gun violence statistics went up. You don't let her get the gun, he beats her to death, gun violence statistics go down. This is part of the reason why I think it was Mark Twain said that there's lies, damn lies in statistics. It's not that statistics don't have value, but they can be incredibly easy to manipulate. Finally, I will just point out from a philosophical standpoint, whenever we're talking about public policy, obviously we want to live in a safe environment. We also want to live in a free environment. There's always going to be a struggle there. If I wanted everyone to be perfectly safe tomorrow, the best way I could ensure that would happen is I could put you all in padded cells. You'd be safe. You'd be safe. Solitary confinement in prison is one of the safest places you could possibly be. And yet, nobody's dying to get in there. So we do want to have a free society. How do we balance these things? Well, for anybody that will tell me that for me to point out that the reason why the Second Amendment was put into place was not for hunting. The reason why it was put into place is because our founders took it very, very seriously, that in order to secure a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Actually, let's take that in its fullness, because that's another one of the arguments I hear. It says, no, Nick, a well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. There's actually a couple of different responsibilities being discussed in there. One has to do with the well-regulated militia, because if you actually look at the founders, they were actually very, very skeptical of standing armies. They were always concerned that the federal government had a big standing army, that the federal government would go looking for wars. But what was the well-regulated militia? Well, if you talk to George Mason, it was made up of the body of the people. The right of the people to keep and bear arms. So understand that our founders weren't just putting this in place because they wanted you to be able to hunt. They weren't even just putting it in place because they wanted you to be able to defend yourself. They thought it was absolutely essential to the security of a free state. And I think sometimes we get used to a certain level of prosperity or comfort by historical standards, and we think, couldn't happen here. I think we have short memories. I think we need to understand that sometimes things also work as a deterrent. Because another thing war has taught me is never fail to underestimate what human beings are capable of justifying once they think they have the power, authority, and moral justification to do it. So, I've always made my position very, very clear. I am more than happy to work with anybody in good faith to try to reduce gun violence, to try to reduce accidental deaths, to try to reduce any sort of death associated with violence, whether it includes a firearm or otherwise. But let's also be honest. When you say you're anti-gun, or when you say you want gun confiscation, or when you say you just want common sense gun control, you're not anti-gun. You still want the government to have them. You just don't want me to. Well, let me put this one right on the nose. My firearms in my hands have never hurt anybody that was innocent, because I have been to war. But they have served to defend my family, and they will continue to do so. It's not a question of whether or not you're going to get them. You aren't. Because I think it's also essential to a free state. I think it's also essential to securing people. And it has never made sense to me that the rights of law-abiding people should be immediately forfeit because somebody else chooses to abuse theirs.